Hello guys, it's Southpaw again, and this time I'm going to be showing you guys how to create a D&D character for 4th edition, okay? So, basically what you do at first, the first thing you do is you do the name, the race, and the class, okay? So I picked a dwarf, which means I get a +2 to my, my constitution, and my wisdom. So I would have had 11 here, but I had a 13 instead. And then I picked a fighter, okay? So every single class has a certain set attribute that is probably its best attribute and its most primary. For a fighter, strength, constitution, and dex are probably probably the most important ones. But since I'm not using ranged weapons, I'm not gonna put much in my dex. So basically, what I do, the first thing you do to a character is you pick the race, the class, and you determine based on the class what race you'll probably pick. So the dwarf gives wisdom and con. Now, these are your primary abilities, which everything scales off of. Okay, if you compare it to League of Legends as your AP and AD, everything scales off of them. So basically, how to roll these is you're gonna roll 6. You're gonna do this procedure 6 times. So you're gonna roll 4 die 6s and pick the highest 3 and add the highest 3 together. So you're gonna have a 6 plus a 6 and a plus a 5. This is an example. So I got a 17 there. Okay. Now you do that 6 times until you get a set, which is what I have here, a set. Now these here, the things to the little parentheses numbers here, those are modifiers. That's where you actually get your scalings off of, because you can't actually scale off all these big numbers. So the key for that is if you have a 10 through an 11, you get a 0. If you have a 12 through a 13, you get a 1. If you have a 14 through a 15, you get a 2. If you have a 16 through a 17, you get a 3. If you get an 18 through a 19, you get a 4, and so on. Like, it's going to increase. So if you roll an 18, which is the max roll you can get, and let's say you're a half orc, which means you get a strength bonus of +2, and you put that 18 in strength, then you're gonna have a 20 in strength. So you actually are gonna have a 5 as the modifier. That's just an example though. So once you get all your modifiers down, you go ahead and head into defenses, which everyone has a base of 10, including the armor class, but we'll move on to the armor class later. The fortitude for this character would be, since I'm a fighter, I get a +2 to fortitude. Since I have a 4 constitution, which I'm actually scaling off these 2 abilities here, and I'm picking the highest modifier. So I picked my 4, so it's a 10, a 4, and a 2 for being a fighter, which means I have a 16 fortitude. Reflex, I start with a 10, I pick between the next 2, and pick the highest, which is the 1, so I get a 11. For my will, I pick between wisdom and charisma, and they're both the same, so I just get a 1, so it's 10 plus 1 equals 11, so those are my defenses. Now, your health comes from your class. This is your health section. Your health comes from your class. Your class will give you a base value, then you add your charisma. For a fighter, it's a 15 plus your constitution number, which means I had an 18 plus I had an 18 plus a 15, which means I had a 33. The second number is your bloodied value, which affects some things, which means I have a 16 because you round down in D&D. And then the third number is the 1/4 of the bloodied value, which is how much you heal per surge. You get your surge value also from your class, which is a certain number plus your constitution modifier, which is for a fighter it's a 9 plus constitution modifier, so I got 13. That's surges per day. I'll explain what surges do later in combat, and just basic rules. For skills, now this is one of the biggest things you have to do here, is skills basically determine what you can do, okay? So this is your entire skill section right here. So how it works is each skill scales off a certain ability, okay? So each skill scales off a certain one. Acrobatics scales off dex, arcana, intelligence, strength for athletics, and so on. It just scales down, okay? So you'd go to on your character sheet there. If you're downloading a regular 4th edition character sheet, which you can just look up on Google and you'll find it, it'll just be a list and it'll show you which ones scale off of which. So you fill in for the skill, you fill in the number that it corresponds to the modifier. So for my dex it would be a 1 because it's an acrobatics, so it scales off dex, and then so that's just a 1 total. Now for arcana, intelligence, so it scales off intelligence, and since I have a 0 intelligence, I'm going to have a 0 arcana. Now, here's the one exception to numbers here, is the total number can also be affected by a system called training. As a class, you get to choose to train certain skills based on the list they give you and how many you can train. For a fighter, you get to choose between a list of like a few, and I can't remember what they are, but I have them already. I already chose between them, and I chose athletics, which gives, so when you train an ability, you get a extra 5 in it. So now since I trained in athletics, I get an 8. I also trained in endurance, and I also trained in, where was my other training one? Let me find it really quickly. I trained in the streetwise, which means I also had a 6. Now, since once you get all those skills calculated, you basically just go down the column, add the scalings to the trainings, and you just figure out your main number. So I have a really high endurance, I have really high athletics, and I have a decent streetwise. Then the next thing you're going to move on to is your initiative. Your initiative is going to be your dex mod, just flat dex mod, so it's going to be 1. Now for me, I picked a feat, which I'll explain later. You get 1 feat at first level, which means I picked improved initiative, which is down here, which I marked. Where was that? Feats, improved initiative, +4 to initiative. So I got a +4 to initiative for that. There's a list in chapter 6 on feats if you want to, if you're gonna make a, if you're gonna make a character, you're gonna need 1 feat. So there's also requirements for each feat. Next, you're going to check your race, and it'll tell you your speed, your movement speed. And for a dwarf, you actually have a passive that allows you to wear plate mail without, or other things that, or other armors that reduce your speed without losing speed. So I actually am going off my base speed here. If I was anything but a dwarf, I'd probably have a lower speed. Next, you pick your alignment. Your alignment, there's a list of it in the earlier chapter. I think it's one of the first chapters, and it'll show you the different ones you can pick from. And basically, just it determines what your character's personality is like. This character's completely undecided on either evil or good, so he can pretty much do what he wants, but he won't murder without reason. Languages, you get that from your race, so you get Common and Dwarven for the dwarf. Now, the racial features. This is just a list of racial features from the racial page that you pick. So the dwarf page, you go to the dwarf page and you read them off, and basically you just mark them down. I'll explain what all this means later, and the DM usually, if you have a really experienced DM, then the DM will just know what it does, and he'll just calculate for it. Like most DMs know that dwarves have low light vision. That's usually an example. And then once you get all your racial features marked down, just make sure you take note of them. Make sure you know that they exist, so you can point out to your DM when something happens. Like, let's say you're a dwarf and you get poisoned, then your saving throw will get a +5, which is actually really helpful. So you gotta remember that kind of thing. A lot of DMs will forget that because there's a lot of stuff to remember in D&D. Now, next is the powers you get. Powers are something in 4th edition that they kind of introduced. It's basically, they basically remove flair from basic attacks, and they basically make you do something. So it kind of annoys me, frankly, that 4th edition did this, but I've kind of house ruled them out a little bit, so basic attacks still stay in. So there's 3 different types of powers. There's at-wills, encounters, and dailies. At-wills mean you can use them once per turn, but it also depends on the action that they take up, which in this case, this cleave here is a standard action, so you can only use it once per turn. And basically, there are 3 parts. There are 3 parts to a power. There's the target, which the target is here, which means you can attack 1 creature. The attack, which is strength versus armor class in this case. So you'd roll a die 20, add your strength modifier, and compare it to their armor class. If you hit, then in this case, you do 1d8 + 3 because this guy's wielding a longsword, which technically this ability would be 1, in parentheses, W + 3. The 1W means 1 weapon. If you have a 2 weapon, it'd be 2 times weapon. Then, in this case, this is a special ability. If this were any other version of D&D, you could just say, I try to swing through the target, and you'd roll a basic attack. But in this case, it's just going to give you the ability cleave, so you can actually just know that you can do it. And the second target, if you have a second, in this attack, basically, you have a primary target. If you hit the primary target, then you get to cleave through the second target, doing strength mod damage, which is 3 in this case. So that's just an example of a power. Now, there's also encounter powers and daily powers. Encounter powers you can only use once per encounter, as assumed. So if an encounter is basically like you run into a group of goblins, your party, you fight them, you kill them, and once you kill them, the encounter's over, so your encounters get refreshed. Dailies are once per day, as you can assume, and basically the DM decides timing, and I'll explain how I do timing later. Basically, timing is kind of discretion, so if the DM decides it's going to be night, it's going to be night, but rounds, a full round in a fight is 6 seconds technically. So the DM can determine how long the fight is in the end. Now, basic attacks. This is how I change basic attacks compared to powers. Okay, so powers I only allow to scale off enhancements to weapons and the mod that they ask for. So in this case, the attack I'm only going to let it scale off the strength, and if he had a +1 longsword, then I allow that as well. But basic attacks can scale off proficiency. This is how I'm house ruling it. Okay, so basically I'm making basic attacks useful by making it to where you get extra bonuses to hit if you do a basic attack. So proficiency is basically if you're proficient in a weapon, you get this bonus, which right here for a longsword it's a +3 if you're proficient to it. So let's say my fighter wants to make a basic attack, so he has a regular longsword. It's going to be a strength versus armor class, but since he has proficiency in it, he's going to have since the strength bonus number is 3, and since he has a +3 because he's proficient, he's going to have a +6. So he's going to roll 1d20 +6 versus armor class. This also I also include class features in this. And since fighters get a +1 when they're wielding their weapon style of choice, I also include that. So he gets a +7 versus armor class to his basic attack, compared to a +3 for his power. That's how I house rule it. If you want to actually do it normally, then the basic attacks are going to be basically obsolete, and people are just going to be using boring powers. And they're going to basically what it's going to do is it's going to be able to make you, for powers, you'll be able to use proficiency and class features and racial features that give you bonuses. Otherwise, I think this makes it a little more interesting and makes it a little more variety. So that's why I do it. If you wanted to go to the normal way, then I just explained it. If you have any questions about this, just ask me. I know it can be confusing. Now, this is how basic attacks work. Okay, so I've already said how you do a melee basic attack. That's strength versus armor class. If you hit, you do 1 weapon plus strength mod. Okay, so basically, you do. It changes for a ranged weapon. Okay, so if you're throwing a dagger or you're firing a bow, it's dex versus armor class, which is a dex mod, not a dex number. That's the big thing. Like, the only time you ever use a full number is when you're doing, like, the DM's trying to determine just, like, if he's trying to determine how beautiful looking your character is, like, how good looking your character is, he'll just look at your charisma. Or if he's trying to calculate your health, he's just going to look at your flat constitution. But otherwise, everything else scales off modifiers. So for a range basic attack, it's going to scale off dex for damage and to hit. So let's say you're using a longbow, then you're going to roll a dex mod plus your proficiency, plus if you have a class feature bonus, and then you're going to compare it to armor class. And then your damage is going to be, if it's a longbow, it'll be a 1d10, because that stands for 1 weapon, and a longbow is 1d10 damage, plus your dex and any class features included. Now, for equipment, this is one of the things this is how you determine your armor class. You get 100 gold at the start. If you go to the equipment section of the Players Handbook, you'll find where the armor is. For this character, I bought plate mail, which is 50 gold, and gives me 8 armor. I'll explain this in a second. I also bought a heavy shield, and I also bought a longsword, which was 15 gold. So I ended up having I don't want to calculate it right now because I didn't do it, but I'll figure it out later. And basically, what this does is the plate mail gives me a +8, and the shield gives me a +2. So if I'm wielding the shield and the armor, then I have a 20 armor class, starting with a base of 10. If I'm wearing leather armor or below, then you get to scale off of your modifiers up here, but you get to scale off, you get to use these, pick between the highest one of these. So if you're wearing cloth armor and you're a mage and you have a +4 modifier, then you're going to have a +4 to your armor class if you're wearing cloth. So if you're a ranger and you're wearing leather and you had like a +4 to your dex, then you get a +4 because you're wearing leather or lower. If you're wearing hider up, you can't scale off dex or intelligence. Now, the last thing you have to do as a character to make your character is to choose a feat. I've already said this. Go to chapter 6, look at the feats. You have certain requirements which are based off abilities, race, class, etc. So you've really just got to creating characters a large amount of understanding what the class features are. So what I recommend is to go to the class page and just read the class page and see what bonuses you get. If you have any questions on how it works, please ask me. But this is the best explanation. This is the fastest and most brief explanation I can do. So if you have any questions, I'm completely willing to answer them in the comments. And this is basically just a brief explanation on how to create a character. So have a good day, and if you have any questions, again, please just feel free to leave a comment. If you like the video, please like the video and subscribe. And I will